You're listening to Conflict Radio on the Conflict Radio Network. Greetings and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today is September 3rd, 2020, and today we're going to be having Dr. Kenneth Hanson on the show. He is a natural storyteller, has through his books, videos, and presentations made a rich treasure of ancient texts accessible to everyone. A scholar of Hebrew language and literature and the history of the Jewish people, from ancient times through the Holocaust and beyond, Ken Hanson is coordinator of the Judaic Studies at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Passionate about his research of the ancient world, Dr. Hanson carries his message beyond the scholarly boundaries in which they were once held captive. His appearance on syndicated radio and national television, the History Channel, have brought ancient insight into everyone's world. A recipient of wide accolade from the print media and in great demand as a popular lecturer, Ken is a frequent guest on radio and TV talk shows in various parts of the country. And he has got a phenomenal YouTube channel. Just search Kenneth Hanson on YouTube and it'll take you right to it. He is quite fascinating to watch. His videos are well done. They're really well put together. It's just a ton of knowledge. So before we get him on, we did get a new kitten here, and I got a few messages from people wanting to see a picture of the kitten, and we will go ahead and post a picture on the Conflict Radio Facebook page. Just search Conflict Radio Network in Facebook and it'll take you to our page. I think there's a couple thousand people there that follow us. So anyway, we're just going to go ahead and get right to it. It's not a long interview. He was hurried for time. It did take a month of scheduling to get him on, so we're pleased to have him for the amount of time that we did have him. I guess we got him for about 45, 50 minutes. So just a ton of information in this interview, so have at it and enjoy. We'll be right back with Dr. Kenneth Hanson right after this. Well, welcome to Conflict Radio. We're with Kenneth Hanson today, Dr. Ken Hanson, and he's going to tell us some stories about the Holy Land and some archaeology that's been going on there. Your newest book, Doctor, is Whose Holy Land? Archaeology Meets Geopolitics in Today's Middle East. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Well, sure, and it's doing well, by the way. If you head over to Amazon and just type in Whose Holy Land, or you can also go to my website, which is drkenhanson.com, all one word, Dr. D.R. Ken Hanson with an O-N. It'll take you also to my YouTube channel, where I have well over 2,000 subscribers, and all kinds of content. And of course, the new book, which means a lot to me because I have lived in the land of Israel for over 3 years and first came as a student quite some time ago and just fell in love with not just the meaning of today's Israel, but the fact that we are living on top of antiquity. Israelis are living on top of the Bible, quite literally. Somebody said, you want to learn about America? Take a book. Want to learn about Israel? Take a shovel. And it's true. And anywhere you go, you just start digging down, and you have the most incredible remains going back thousands and thousands of years. This was a Jewish land, an ancient Jewish land. And when you think of all of the peoples who have lived on this earth, the various kingdoms, the various tribes, where are they today? I mean, even the Roman Empire, where are the Romans today? I mean, you can talk about Italians, but can anybody stand up and say, hey, I'm a Roman, right? Or how about the Egyptians? Well, today's Egyptians are not the ancient Egyptians, I'm sorry. And so many other ancient peoples, the Canaanites, the Philistines, and a host of others, Amorites, Amalekites, Ammonites, on and on. And where are they? Gone. All gone. And yet you look at the people of Israel, the Israelites. This is the only people on earth who have lost their land thousands of years ago, who've been exiled across the planet for 2 millennia, and yet who have come back in relatively recent times to found a new state, a new Jewish state. This people has not disappeared. And this is unique in human history. And it dawned on me, when we look at the ancient archaeology, how much it dovetails with what's going on in the state of Israel today, of people who tenaciously cling to their homeland and who have the audacity to want to live in the proximity of these ancient sites. It's very controversial, mind you, because there are a lot of folks out there, including the majority of the UN delegations, who basically have said, you Jews have no right to live in certain contested territories. And they're saying, dig down, this is the Bible. These are the tombs of the patriarchs are right here in ancient Hebron. And you're telling us that we can't live in ancient Hebron? That's what is at stake today. Very incendiary, and it's right in the headlines almost every day.
Well, we're in the U.S. having a lot of problems with the UN and infringing on what we should, what they're saying we can do and what we can't do, and it seems like the UN's getting a little out of control. Your book is about archaeology meets geopolitics, and I'm just curious how the geopolitics is affecting the archaeology over there today,
and how the archaeology is affecting the geopolitics. Take Hebron, which I just mentioned. Ancient Hebron, as we pronounce it in Hebrew. We have Jews who want to live in this city, who have bought property. Anybody can buy property anywhere. It's legal. Well, they want to live in Hebron because we have the most spectacular ancient structure right in this city, in the heart of this city today. It's enormous, built of great limestone ashlar blocks, originally erected by King Herod the Great, but it sits right on top subterranean caves, which, according to the ancient stories, are exactly where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, the patriarchs and matriarchs were buried long ago in antiquity. It's an ancient site. And Jews want to live near it. They bought property there. How did they come to be able to buy property there? And for that, we have to go into a little geopolitics of the year 1967. 1967, this 6-day war, which was a defensive war, really, on Israel's part. The Egyptians had blocked the Straits of Tiran, which effectively blocked shipping in and out of the Israeli port of Eilat. That's an act of war. And Israel responded with a brilliant strike against the Egyptian Air Force, which basically blew up the whole Egyptian Air Force on the ground. And in 6 days, it was Israel's blitzkrieg. Israel took the entire Sinai Peninsula, all the way up to the Suez Canal. Also, Israel frantically telegraphed King Hussein of Jordan, saying, look, this is between us and Egypt and of course, Syria up in the north. Please, Jordanians, you stay out of this. And Jordan responded to that frantic telegraph by opening cannon fire all along the border of the state of Israel. Now, bear in mind that back in 1947, the UN, the United Nations, agreed to partition Palestine. That's what it was called, the partition, which means we'll take everything, all the territory from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. It's only about 50 miles wide, not much territory. But we're going to divide that, we're going to subdivide that into a proposed Jewish state and an Arab Palestinian state, which was supposed to be born officially in 1948. This territory was British, under British occupation. The British left in 1948, turned it over to the UN, and they said, okay, British are out. we'll have two states now, a tiny little sliver of a Jewish state with only between 9 and 11 miles wide along the Mediterranean Sea. That was the Jewish state. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
And everything east of that to the Jordan River would be the Palestinian state. Well, the Palestinians rejected it out of hand, turned it down. They would not allow even the existence of a Jewish state. Well, thereafter, the Jordanians came in and just annexed this territory that was supposed to be a Palestinian state. They said, it's ours now. Where was the UN outcry? Where was the international outcry? This is supposed to be a Palestinian state. How dare you, Jordanians, have taken it over? Nobody said a word. Nobody said a word. So in 1967, this was Jordanian controlled, and cannon fire erupted. Israel had this little 9 to 11 mile strip along the Mediterranean Sea. That was the state of Israel. And they started bombarding Jerusalem, Tel Aviv. Hey, we told you to stay out of it. Well, they obviously didn't. So Israel attacked not only Egypt, but Jordan. And they took all the territory up to the Jordan River. Again, we're talking about only 40 to 50 miles of territory. Now it's under new management, under the Israelis. And it's been under Israeli management ever since, in spite of the international outcry. And even in this country, there's a lot of sympathy for the oppressed Palestinians, not realizing how this came about. Israel might have done like Arab nations and just said, hey, we conquered this territory, you locals here, you can get out. But they didn't. They didn't say that. Palestinian Arabs, you may stay.
Yeah, you know, when did that ever start? I mean, we go back, you know, hundreds and thousands of years, and if a country is at war with a country and you lose, guess what? That country belongs to the winner.
Well, wars, like elections, have consequences, which I state in my book. They really do. So you declare war, you lose. Hey, there's consequences to this. Now, after the State of Israel was formed officially, and they had to fight literally a war of independence, a war in 1948, just to survive. They were attacked by 5 Arab nations simultaneously who vowed that they would push the Jews into the sea. And this is right after the Holocaust, can you imagine?
Yeah.
We're going to push you into the sea. And everybody thought that the Jews would lose. The Jews will lose, but they didn't. It was a staggering death toll, but they survived. They kept their 9 to 11 mile strip along the Mediterranean. They enlarged it just a little bit, but they survived. In the meantime, Jews were living and had been living for centuries, in some cases millennia, in Arab nations across the Middle East, from Algeria to Sudan to Iran and Iraq and Oman and Yemen, and all of these countries began to expel their Jews, saying, hey, you have a Jewish state now, why don't you get out? And they literally put these Jewish populations in fear of their lives. And where was the international outcry then? People don't realize some 600,000 Jews living in Arab lands for centuries, even millennia, fled to the new state of Israel, which had to absorb them. And where was the international outcry? Jewish refugees, and Israel had to absorb them all. Within 5 years, how many refugees, Jewish refugees, were still living in squalid camps in the state of Israel? How about none? 0. They were all absorbed. Now, 50, 60, 70 years after Israel's war of independence, how many Palestinian refugees are scattered across the Middle East in squalid camps? A couple of million. And their numbers have grown. And there's only one way to explain that, and that is that Arab states want them there. They want them as refugees in order to further pressure Israel to depict them as an oppressed people and turn the nations of the world and the UN all the more against Israel's right to exist. So that's what's going on internationally. But again, the archaeology speaks volumes. There are Jewish remains in these places that Israel, quote unquote, conquered in the war of 1967. Places like Jericho. We've all heard of the city of Jericho and its walls that came tumbling down, right? This was an ancient Jewish city, conquered, of course, by Joshua, if you read the Bible, conquered from the Canaanites, and it became Israelite ever since. Well, there it is again. And Jews simply want the ability to live in proximity of their ancient city. And yet the settlements that they have established there are considered illegal by the United Nations, by international law. But there's the remains right in front of our eyes. If you have enough chutzpah to go to Israel these days and actually check out Jericho, it's tied with the oldest city on earth. It's 9,000 years old. And we can literally walk through the remains, as I've done many times, having lived there, and look at the ancient walls, get into the debate of Joshua and the conquest of Jericho by the Israelites. It's there in front of our eyes, and yet Jews have no right to live there.
Yeah, so, is it stopping the archaeology?
Well, the archaeology has been interrupted on the Palestinian side ever since the creation of the Palestinian Authority under the Oslo Accords. Now, when I first went to Israel, there was no Palestinian Authority. There had been no Oslo Accords yet. This was all Israeli-administered territory. It had not been formally annexed by Israel. Israel waited, essentially, hoped to gain some political traction, which it never did. So it just left these territories Israeli-administered, but not annexed, not formally made part of Israel. But we could go anywhere. My classmates and I was a young student at the time, and we were out in the archaeology every day. We were all over the quote-unquote West Bank, which we ought to call Judea and Samaria. That's its proper term. It's its proper biblical term, Judea and Samaria, Jewish territories, which now the international community prefers to call the West Bank of the Jordan River. And there was archaeology all through these areas. Jewish archaeology, Israelis were able to excavate. It's not so easy these days. Some archaeology has been undertaken on the Israeli side, but it's not an easy process at all, because the Palestinian Authority is now basically in charge of these sensitive areas. There is supposed to be mutual understanding and mutual access, and even an agreement was forged to that effect, but it was never fully implemented. So it's a problem.
Yeah, hopefully it gets sorted out soon, because there's still a lot to find.
Oh, yes. And the discoveries just keep on coming. Even this summer, we have new discoveries in the area. In fact, in Jerusalem itself, we have a stunning discovery just about a month ago. And this is in what's called the City of David in Old Jerusalem. Now, I lived actually on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. How would you like to live on Mount Zion? It was unbelievable. That was where my school was located when I first went to Israel. And we were, as I mentioned, out in the archaeological ruins every day almost. Well, not far from there, right adjacent to the old city walls, is an area that has been fairly freshly excavated. Beginning in 1997 was the first modern dig in this area, which we can call the City of David. Israeli archaeologist Eilat Mazar started digging down, and in the year 2005, she discovered foundations of a large stone structure, a very large stone structure, which would in fact be a perfect fit for the palace of none other than King David. Try to wrap your brain around that.
Oh, wow.
And just as I mentioned, about a month ago in August, we have in that same dig, we have the discovery of burnt wooden beams and charred stone. Now, to the uninitiated, to a novice, that might not mean much, but when we compare archaeology with texts, I'm talking about biblical texts, we're told that the army of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar attacked and destroyed the city of Jerusalem in the year 586 before the Common Era. Burnt it, and he destroyed the great temple. And everybody's heard of Solomon's temple. There's no trace of it today. It was destroyed. It was burned down. And now we have literally coming out of the ground a burnt beam, burnt char marks on the wall of one of these buildings. And we're pinpointing the exact date of the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, before the Common Era. And those who realize what's at stake here just get goosebumps, because we're not talking just about an old piece of wood. We're talking about verifying a biblical account, which, frankly, a lot of minimalist folks and minimalist scholars, we call them, deny. There's no history here. It's just a bunch of folklore and fable. But when you put together text and artifact, line them up together, you're on to something. And it's as though something new, something fresh is always being discovered. And also, just this last summer, we have near an Israeli kibbutz, that's a communal farm in Israel. We have the discovery of the remains, the foundations of a very substantial ancient fortress that dates even earlier, going back to the days of the biblical judges. We're talking about maybe 3,200 years old. And there it is, just uncovered the foundations of this massive fort with 4 huge towers on each corner, one tower on each corner, that appears to have been built and co-inhabited by Egyptians and Canaanites. The Canaanites, whom we're told Israel conquered. And there it is in the biblical book of Judges. You've got an account of the Philistines. Maybe you've heard of the Philistines coming in from the west, and the Israelites coming in from the east, and basically battling each other, while the Canaanites, who had built this fort, just vanished from the scene. And that's pretty interesting, because today's Palestinians actually claim that their roots go back to the ancient Canaanites. So they're the real inhabitants of the land. And with all due respect, that's nonsense. Because here we have more evidence in stone. The Canaanites as a people vanished. Where are the Canaanites today? I'm sorry, they're not the Palestinian Arabs. They're one of these groups who literally disappeared from history, like all of the others. Only the Jews remain.
Now, the fire you're talking about, is that the fire where they lost the Ark?
The Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the... What became of the Ark of the Covenant? Everybody wants to know, including Harrison Ford. Well, the Ark itself vanished from history and from the biblical account. We're told that it was fashioned out in the Sinai desert in the days of Moses, and that the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments, along with a jar of manna and Aaron's rod that budded, were placed in this gold-covered chest that looks a lot, if you just read the description of it, like an Egyptian chest. And that alone is phenomenal, because if all of this had just been fabricated out of whole cloth, which our minimalist scholars suggest, that they just made up, there was never an Ark of the Covenant, they just made it up, it's a fairy tale. Well, how did they get the description of it so accurate in terms of what a piece of Egyptian furniture would look like? That's real circumstantial evidence that Israelites must, in fact, have lived in Egypt at one point before they left in what the Bible calls a great exodus. But this Ark of the Covenant was carried across the desert into the Promised Land under Joshua as he conquered Jericho, which we talked about, and then made its way ultimately to the city of Jerusalem, where it was carried by young David himself, who conquered the Canaanite city of Jebus and renamed it Jerusalem. And he brought the Ark of the Covenant up to the city and placed it in a portable tabernacle there in Jerusalem. Then, we're told, it was placed inside of the great temple of Solomon. That's the one that was burnt to the ground by the Babylonians in 586 before the Common Era. But there's no record of the Ark having been destroyed or burnt. In fact, the prophet Jeremiah from the Bible made a list of the sacred objects of the temple which were captured by the Babylonians and taken away before they burned the temple down, like the golden table of the showbread and the golden menorah and various utensils and items of the temple furniture. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't mention the Ark of the Covenant. It's as if it just vanished at some point before the temple was destroyed. And all kinds of folklore as to where it might have ended up. Some people think it might have gone down to Egypt in the days of Ethiopia in the days of the Queen of Sheba, or maybe it was buried out in a cave in the desert, and we have an apocryphal text. That's a book that never made it into our Bibles that suggests that the prophet Jeremiah took it out into the desert and buried it in a cave where it will be sequestered until the end of time. But in fact, I have a friend of mine who's an amateur archaeologist who believes, in fact, it's out there and he's on the trail of it. Can you imagine?
Well, that would just be awesome.
Go ahead.
It'd be awesome.
Yeah, we don't have anything solid. We don't have anything solid to go on there. But there's another story that before the destruction of the temple, the sacred ark was lowered into underground chambers, which honeycomb the area which we call the Temple Mount in Jerusalem to this day. The Temple Mount. It's an enormous limestone platform as large as 24 football fields, absolutely massive, of Jerusalem limestone. And beneath it are many, many caverns in every direction. You couldn't make this up. This is so Indiana Jones. And the stories go that the ark was lowered down into one of these caverns before the temple was burnt down. And that's why it's never been discovered.
So what do you think?
Well, we were talking about the Six-Day War, 1967, when Israel conquered Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, up to the Jordan River, took it back from the Jordanians. They also conquered East Jerusalem. Now, up until 1967, Jerusalem was a divided city. The west side was in Jewish hands. The east side was in Arab hands. And as I mentioned, annexed by the Kingdom of Jordan. And right down the middle was a barbed wire no man's land with landmines. I'm not kidding. It was unbelievable. It was like the Berlin of the Middle East. And all of these sacred sites were on the Arab side, in Arab East Jerusalem. And you asked if Jewish archaeologists have access. No way. No, it was off limits until 1967. Israel conquered, and it did formally annex East Jerusalem. Now the city is divided. There's no more barbed wire, no more landmines, thank goodness. Even though, can you imagine, the international community wants to redivide Jerusalem. They want to do it again and demand that Israel withdraw from East Jerusalem and turn it into a divided city. And people just sheepishly nod, oh, yeah, it's fine, it's fine. Nonsense. Well, now that the Israelis took it, almost immediately there was a push to explore as much as possible. there was an Israeli rabbi. He was known as the Rabbi Emeritus of the Western Wall. A lot of folks call it, it's actually incorrect, the Wailing Wall, the most holy site in Jerusalem. It's the Western Wall of the Temple Mount itself. Since the temple is destroyed, this is the wall of that enormous limestone platform, and the closest anybody can get to where the temple would have stood. And this Israeli rabbi, Yehuda Getz, began to nurture a secret desire to get as close to the ancient shrine as possible. What a character this guy was. He was always clothed in black with a white headscarf, and he went around with a Bible and a prayer book in his pocket and a pistol in a side holster. Orthodox rabbi. Mm-hmm. And in 1967, he started digging a clandestine tunnel underground along that holy wall, the majority of which was covered over with centuries of debris and rubble. And now he's underground digging along that wall. It took him years. And in 1982, he comes upon a long-sealed ancient entrance to the Temple Mount, known as Warren's Gate. And he was convinced that if he could break through there, he would be quite literally underneath where Solomon's temple once stood. Incredible. I like to tell people, you could not make this stuff up. And a year later, 1983, Rabbi Getz manages to break through this gate, and he finds an enormous carved tunnel, about 6 meters wide, 28 meters long, leading due east toward the remains of temple foundations. Long sealed for centuries and centuries. The floor was covered with mud and water. And he wrote in his journal, and immediately he fell on his face, sprawled forward with tears streaming down his cheeks. And he claimed that he actually laid eyes on the Ark of the Covenant. Now, he never wrote that down. People question whether he really saw it, but there wasn't much time for him to investigate, because up on top of that limestone platform, on the Arab side, the sounds of digging were heard coming up through one of the sewage grates on top of the Temple Mount platform. And immediately, some stalwart young Arabs were dispatched down through the grates into the subterranean caverns, and they met up with Rabbi Getz and his team, and literally a riot broke out underground. It was fisticuffs, and they came to blows. Now, the rabbi withdrew, and he didn't want trouble, obviously, because this is such a sensitive area. Even though Israel had conquered it, they didn't want massive riots to break out everywhere. The Israelis, having gotten wind of what had happened, ordered the rabbi to not only withdraw, but to cover that entrance with reinforced concrete and never to go back. And so it remains to this day. Folks who go on pilgrimage, who take a trip to Israel, can actually walk through that tunnel. I've been there many times. Wish I could take a tour, as I've done in the past, not in the days of COVID, but I love to escort people and show them exactly where the rabbi broke through. That's as close as we can get. And to this day, we don't know what might be down there.
That's interesting. Where do you think the Ark is? Where, like you personally, do you have any?
If it survives, guess, I think there's as good a chance that it's there as anywhere.
Yeah.
Although, just from a scholarly perspective, it is so rare that ancient artifacts survive at all. When we find something, anything, it's an anomaly. It's unbelievable that anything survives. Usually what we have are fragments of broken pot shards. And then the archaeologists have to gingerly piece the fragments together to try to recreate the pot with glue. But to think that an intact ancient chest would have survived intact with the Ten Commandments inside, realistically, it is way unlikely. So it's a huge question mark. I doubt on a personal level that it survived. But I wonder why there was no record made, either of its capture or of its destruction. And for that, I have no answer. So I hold out that there may yet be a slim chance that it's down there in those caverns. But the situation is so sensitive. I do think we ought to be able to explore. But even though Israel formally annexed East Jerusalem, it was so careful not to upset the status quo that it allowed the Palestinians to have a sort of mini fiefdom on the Temple Mount. In other words, there's a Palestinian authority called the Waqf, which has its own guards, its own police force, its own jurisdiction on top of the Temple Mount. And Israel allowed that in order to show that it really respects other religions, and even though it conquered this territory, it doesn't mean to lord over conquered peoples and oppress them. Did that do any good in the international community? No, Israel still gets condemned. What Arab nation would allow Jews to have their own mini jurisdiction at a Jewish holy site inside, say, Iraq? I don't think so.
Yeah, right. That's not happening.
I don't think so. Not happening. But they did, and so we can't explore these areas. Israel won't allow it. The Arabs won't allow it. Now, there have been some Israeli Jews who would seriously like to go up there, even to walk around on top of the Temple Mount, which is now a big problem. There's another Israeli rabbi who's actually escorted groups of people up on top of the Temple Mount. And there are Israelis who would like to actually see the temple, the Jewish temple, rebuilt one day. Now, what sits on top of the temple today? It's a Muslim shrine called the Dome of the Rock, a great Muslim shrine. And it's a landmark. If you just Google a photo of Jerusalem, you'll see the Golden Dome. That's the landmark. It's the third holiest site in Islam. And it actually, I'm convinced, covers the spot of the Jewish temple itself. If directly underneath that Golden Dome is bedrock. And the bedrock has certain impressions in it. I've seen those impressions, like indentations in the bedrock. That's why it's called the Dome of the Rock. In Muslim tradition, this is where the Prophet Abraham, having miraculously been transported from Mecca in a single night, ascended into the heavens on a ladder of light to meet Allah. And so that's why it's the third holiest site in Islam. And it was from that rock that the Prophet Muhammad ascended. That's the Arab story. However, if you look at those grooves, those indentations, and scholars have actually measured them when it was still possible to do that, and found that the measurements are exactly those recorded in biblical and Jewish texts of the ancient temple itself. And a smaller indentation in the middle, which I've also seen personally, fits the exact dimensions, believe it or not, of the Ark of the Covenant. Wow. So Jews want to be able to go up there, and they're not able to, most of them.
Makes you wonder if somebody else doesn't have it.
Have the Ark, yeah. Well, why wouldn't we have heard about it? That's my question. So again, I think that if it survived, it's probably hidden away down underneath somewhere.
So I know you're short for time, and I wanted to talk to you about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but in particular, I wanted to talk about the Dead Sea War Scrolls. They were found with the Dead Sea Scrolls, like all together, weren't they, or were they found separately?
Well, yeah, here's another incredible archaeological find. Back in the year 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd boy was tending his flock out near the Dead Sea. This is also Arab territory back then. And one of his goats went missing. He started looking for his missing goat, rummaging through various caves in the vicinity, and stumbled upon a row of long neglected earthenware jars leaning up against the inner recesses of a darkened cave. And prying them open, he discovered the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient parchments, 2,000 years old. And as I just mentioned, even to find little broken pieces of pottery is incredible. Imagine intact jars with scrolls inside, 2,000 years old. Unbelievable. Again, you couldn't make this up. He didn't know what they were, but they were circulated around. They ended up in the open market in a little town called Bethlehem, where they were purchased by a Greek Orthodox archbishop who took them to the United States, who sold them to an Israeli archaeologist. It's quite a story. I wrote a whole book about it. And here we have the oldest biblical texts in the world, as well as scores and scores of non-biblical texts that never made it into our Bibles. We didn't even know they existed until the discovery of these scrolls. And one of them has been dubbed the War Scroll. Now, it doesn't say that on the scroll. In Hebrew, the archaeologists call it Milchemet B'nei Or B'nei Choshech. You got that? Mm-hmm. The war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, or the War Scroll. And here it is in ancient Hebrew. And the thing is, Hebrew hasn't changed in 2,000 or even 3,000 years. I learned Hebrew while I was living in modern Israel. I speak the modern language. And here I am now able to cuddle up with these ancient documents and read them like a newspaper. It's incredible. And sure enough, here we have this entire document, this War Scroll, that depicts a series of 7 great end-time battles, the end of days, between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, whoever they are. We never told their names, between the good guys and the bad guys. And 3 of those battles will be won by the sons of light. 3 more will be won by the sons of darkness, the evil ones. And the final 7th battle will be won by the Almighty, who's going to descend with a whole host of angels at the end of days and win it on behalf of the sons of light. That's the War Scroll. So they fully believed 2,000 years ago that they were living in the end of days, and it would happen any minute. Well, sure enough, a great revolt did break out not long after that scroll was written against the Roman Empire. The Romans controlled the land of Israel in those days. You're familiar with Ben-Hur.
Yeah.
That's the Romans.
Now, were the scrolls put in the cave to kind of hide them, or were people living in the cave at the time and maybe they were just left there?
Well, that's part of the controversy. We don't have an exact description of how they got in those caves. Some think that these were just assorted texts that were composed up in Jerusalem and carted down and hidden away in these caves for safekeeping. I don't buy that, personally. I think that they were written by an ancient sectarian group. Even that's controversial, but I think that this group had a name. They were known as the Essenes, who are described by the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, the Essene group. And I think this was their headquarters. I think that they were living, many of them, out in these caves. But we also have, adjacent to the caves, another archaeological excavation of their quarters where they actually worked and, I think, copied these scrolls. It's a massive archaeological find. You can go visit that as well in Israel today.
Wow,
so
really
they copied these scrolls, and in advance of the marauding Romans, my theory is they hid them in these caves for safekeeping.
Yeah. Now, a couple quick questions that I wanted to ask you. The archaeology that's been done around where they say Moses crossed the Red Sea, have they actually found chariots? I've heard that they found chariots and things that prove that he actually parted the sea. Is that true?
Well, to be honest, we don't have a clue where the Red Sea crossing was, and I'll also be honest, as a scholar, I'm in the minority today of scholars, most of whom think that probably there was no Exodus and probably there was no Moses. That's how far it has shifted today in the halls of academe and in the ivory towers. Only a minority of us think that there must have been a Moses. If there had been no Moses, we would have to invent one because his presence was that important for the Israelite people, the Jewish people in the end. What evidence do we have of the Exodus? Not a scrap of archaeology has ever been discovered to authenticate a group of 3 million Hebrews, or even a smaller group, crossing into the area of the Sinai. Wouldn't they have left something? Wouldn't they have left, talk about potsherds, that many people, wouldn't they have left potsherds? Why don't we have any? Well, yeah. We're not sure how many crossed, and the numbers in the Bible, to be honest, are oftentimes symbolic. And if we're talking about 600,000 men of war, we might actually be talking about 600 tent groups, which is another interpretation of the word thousand in Hebrew. Elef in thousand could mean a tent group. In other words, 600 tents of soldiers could have been the Exodus. All of this is speculative. I doubt if there were 3 million, but I do think there was an Exodus. Where it happened, well, actually the Bible tells us that it was across the Yam Suf, which it gets translated as the Red Sea, but to be honest, Yam Suf means the Sea of Reeds. And that would have been in the land of Goshen, in the northern Nile Delta, a reed-like, more shallow body of water. And it says that plainly in the Hebrew. So anything else found elsewhere in the Red Sea, including the supposed chariot wheels, doesn't match even what the biblical text says. And those who have examined those do think that they're probably natural anomalies, or if there's something else, they may have been deposited there many, many centuries later. The sea does have a way of decaying things, by the way. I'm fascinated by the story of the Titanic. But, even the Titanic is disappearing after just, 100 years?
Yeah.
It's rusting away in another couple of centuries. It'll just be a little pile of iron on the ocean floor. So something 3,000 years old, I have problems with that. I'll be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a good point. Now, they say in archaeology there was a big battle between giants and man in Israel. Is there any proof of that we've been able to find?
We've got texts, and we've got, again, a whole bunch of texts that never made it into the Bible. I wrote a book on that as well. Plus, I've been featured on the History Channel. It's a classic show by now called Banned from the Bible. It's a 2-hour special, and you can Google that, in fact, Banned from the Bible, too, and I'm all over that, and talking about these ancient texts. And one of them does, in fact, talk about giants who were in the land. Some of them, we're told, actually made it on board Noah's Ark, if you can believe that. Now, here again, we look at the Hebrew text, and that's the advantage of living in Israel and learning to speak Hebrew.
Yeah.
The word giant can also be rendered a person of valor, or a great hero. A gibor is a giant, but also a person of valor, like a mighty warrior. So are we talking about enormous giants? Well, the books that never made it talk about these beings who were 3,000 cubits tall and literally devouring the flesh of humans. Frankly, I think that's probably why this book never made it into the Bible, because even the Jewish people didn't believe that. So it's one of those fuzzy areas. But I will say that we should be careful just not to dismiss everything. We're told later that the Israelites sent spies into the Promised Land, and they were terrified of the giants. So how big were these giants? Was Goliath a giant? Actually, the Dead Sea Scrolls help us there, too, because there's a version of that story that say that the height of Goliath was not 6 cubits, which is what the Bible tells us. That would be over 9 feet tall, but 4 cubits in a span, which is about 6.5 feet tall. So we had a difference between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the biblical text.
Yeah.
And I think the Dead Sea Scrolls are right. It's hard to believe anybody be 9 feet tall, especially in ancient times. But 6.5, 7 feet tall, when most people were barely 5 feet tall, there we're onto something. So when we're talking about giants, I think we may be more in that span.
All right, and I guess I got just one more question for you. I know you got to go. You're in a hurry today, but I wanted to ask you. There's a lot of new archaeology going on. I guess it's called the forbidden archaeology that we were once an old ancient civilization with high tech and high technology and you know hundreds of thousands of years ago. What do you think about that?
I think that when we look at the technology of antiquity, it's staggeringly advanced. Go back even to ancient Babylon, which we mentioned early on. Here was a city, ancient Babylon, which had anything you could imagine, even techniques of brain surgery. And anything you want could be. You could imagine a university with any number of subjects. That would be ancient Babylonian.
Yeah. Well,
so I think that a lot of this stuff was extremely advanced for its day and age. And you look at the pyramids and so on. Did they have high tech? No. These things were constructed without modern equipment. So on that level, still, these are ancient societies and what we would call primitive, and yet they managed to construct things that we could not ever construct today. The Temple Mount, which I mentioned, there's one stone in the Temple Mount that weighs in at 560 tons. One stone. How on earth did they move it? Well, it wasn't aliens, and so I'm not into junk science. But they were able to do things with the technology that they had, which were amazing.
Well, Dr. Hanson, I certainly appreciate you coming on and spending some time with us today. You want to tell everybody where they can find you?
Go to drkenhanson.com, DrKenHanson, one word, drkenhanson.com, and you have links there to my books, my YouTube channel, which is amazing, if I can brag about it, and all sorts of other goodies. So dig in, enjoy.
Yeah, and if you do dig in and enjoy, you're going to enjoy it because your YouTube channel is really interesting. There's so much there. It really is quite the channel. I'll be looking at it more and more as I go through the weekend here, and we'll be right back.
And don't forget Whose Holy Land, my new book. Archaeology meets geopolitics in today's Middle East.
All right, and we'll be right back on Conflict Radio right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. That's going to do it for us today. Remember to like and subscribe on YouTube if you're watching us there. You can also find us on Apple iTunes, Spreaker, and iHeartRadio podcasts and all the normal podcast catchers. You can also check out our website, www.conflictradio.net. If you're searching for us on YouTube, make sure to search for Conflict Radio Network. That's our channel. Go ahead and subscribe. Check us out. And we are also available on Facebook, Conflict Radio Network on Facebook. Go ahead and like our page. We post all of our updates there as well. You can also find us on Twitter. Just search Conflict Radio. And there we are. Until next time, I guess Tuesday, we'll be back Tuesday evening. Until then, batten down the hatches and be safe.